So imagine for a moment you have finished your main story in Final Fantasy XIV. You've hit level 90, and you're maybe considering leveling other jobs. You might have dabbled in a few along the way, but now you're starting to engage in things like your roulettes more often. Leveling roulettes. You're running old raids you may have missed. You're going and farming up old relics you may have missed. You're running fates. And what you are finding is more and more content that takes you out of this fresh dinged level 90 content experience you had and starts to put you into what we call level sync. This is where we take your level and we put you back down to the appropriate level for what it was at the time or for what that content was designed to be. There are a handful of pieces of content that actually sync you up, but the majority of sync in Final Fantasy XIV takes your level down. And it doesn't just take your level and your stats down, it artificially skews your gear down, and so the way syncing affects gear is really weird. That is why people who run old ultimates have optimal best in slot for that gear, because it messes with the way it interacts with melds. And it restricts your abilities back to the abilities that were available at the time and the traits that were available at the time. So some abilities may no longer be accessible on your bar, and some abilities may change back to a previous form, which can change your rotation. Oftentimes we feel this most pronounced when we are on jobs that sync back to a less refined version of themselves, a different version of themselves, or a very basic and boring version of itself. Especially under the context of where you are now. Maybe this was your first ever video game and 2 or 3 abilities was plenty back then. But by now you're level 90. You know how to play a class that has 10 or 15 abilities. And since each job in this game is designed to be a valid experience to be your main and to be your first experience in this game, every single job in this game starts as a very simple version of itself. And so even though you may have leveled 4 melees up to level 90, that 5th melee is still going to assume you have never played Melee, you have never played Final Fantasy XIV. And yes, some jobs start out a little higher, like Reaper and Sage now starting out the highest, but they still oftentimes are a much simpler version than they are at level cap. And so Brian and I reacted over on Work to Game about to a Zepla post, and a big part of that post ended up very centered on level sync, and so I saw some comments over there talking about maybe some suggestions of other ways that games could handle it, and that kind of told me that maybe this would be an interesting topic to talk about within the context of how the level sync system works in Final Fantasy, what it does well, what it does poorly, and then take a look at 2 other systems, Guild Wars 2 and World of Warcraft, in Final Fantasy vocabulary, and decide what would it look like if we instead took the Guild Wars system or the World of Warcraft system, but used it in Final Fantasy, because we do have different side content systems, different gear progression, different combat mechanics, and so even if we just picked up their level sync equivalent system and dropped it into Final Fantasy, it would still feel very, very different here than it does in their game, because the only way to make an MMO truly carbon copied is you'd have to copy the whole thing, because a lot of these systems interplay with each other, and so an identical system that kind of stands as an island and is then forced to interact with all these other things takes on a new life of its own. So the handful of times we've seen carbon copies or near carbon copies in MMOs, they're still not exactly the same thing. So level sync in Final Fantasy XIV is there to preserve content. One of the best examples of what level sync does is because main story quests, the MSQ, is required of every single player beginning back in A Realm Reborn. They have to begin back in 2013, 2014 content, and they have to play through content that was designed to run on very old computers and PS3s, and they have to play that all the way up to today's content in order, and along the way they have to play a vast number of 4 and 8 man pieces of content and a couple of 24 man pieces of content at a minimum. We know for a fact that we have asked those players to take on an immense amount of solo content, and that solo content is going to be gated at various checkpoints by group content. And so we need to create a system that incentivizes players to go back and help those people clear those barriers. So the first thing Level Sync does well is it facilitates the narrative development of players who are just simply not where you're at. They started this game today, and they need to get through the main scenario. They have to get through the main scenario. Even if they're coming over to be an epic raider or a PvPer, at the end of the day, if they want to experience all these jobs, you have to clear the main story. It doesn't matter if you're pushing the escape key on every cutscene or you're dwelling on every word, you have to clear the main story. And that requires an immense amount of instance content. They do sell an ability to skip this, but that's not the premier preferred path. Most people don't want to buy a game and then pay to skip part of that game. And so a lot of people go through MSQ, even ones whose story is not their thing. So we have to facilitate group content. We have to do that. So leveling content does that. The second thing it does is it acts as a form of historic preservation. It saves things like ultimates in as close to as is reasonable a state that they remain relevant. When we look at the fact that people are still comfortable running Bozja Zadnor, running Eureka, running UCOB, running T, all of these pieces of content, and they still go back, and we have things like Moogle Tombstone events, MSQ Roulette, Alliance Raid Roulette, where some people just do them to do them. That is the benefit of Level Sync, that we have allowed our legacy content to remain relevant without it feeling like when I go back there, I just blast through it. It would not feel good to the new player to just get dragged along. Now, there is a downside. The way they have chosen to do that is that they sync us back to a version of ourselves. That means if you're actively leveling that alternate job, which is a very common reason to end up in a large amount of synced content, because your Frontlines Roulette and Leveling Roulette are two of the most optimal ways, and that immediately takes you into the PvP action system and a level synced version of yourself. So you're very rarely playing your most up-to-date version. It feels like you're actively being taken away from learning your jobs. Many people who have watched me level up over on Twitch find it very frustrating when I'm leveling their main job because I don't take a job seriously while leveling it. Because I feel like that's just setting me up for frustration. Because every time I see an ability and I'm like, okay, and I'm trying to work it in my head, I then go join my leveling roulette for the day, and it takes me back to like Toto Rock, and I spend 20 minutes not doing the thing I just learned. And then I come back out and I'm gonna go do my hunts, and things are dying so fast, or I can't afford to AoE pull a fate, and I still can't use that ability. And so like I spend so little time able to use that ability the way it's designed to be used that I actually find it just makes the process less enjoyable than if I just ignore it and I just push glowing buttons and I try to mimic a combo and I try to stay in up-to-date gear and not stand in mechanics as best as is reasonable. And when I get to cap, I'll try to become a better player. The game encourages me to do that because it actively pulls you back. And so the downside is that when it pulls you back, it doesn't do it well. They've gotten better at it as we now have moved into Endwalker, which, you know, feels like Trait Walker, where we basically left a lot of jobs in kind of a Shadowbringers state, then modified. And that means that, for example, a lot of your Shadowbringers content feels very familiar. It feels very good. It's different, but it's similar. And that's because Endwalker really didn't add a bunch to your bars, it modified a bunch onto your bars. And so syncing down to 80 does not feel as bad as 80 down to 70 did, in my opinion, or 70 down to 60, 60 down to 50. And so I think that, you know, as they've talked about, they went back and renewed a little bit of Summoner and a little bit of Monk. If they could slowly go back and maybe make a pass through each job, and then probably a second or a third pass through each job, they could probably get to a reasonable set of things where dropping back didn't feel so disconnected, especially with jobs whose rotations have changed drastically over the years. So how do these other games tackle this? Well, Guild Wars 2, once you hit the end of their A Realm Reborn, we're going to use all Final Fantasy terms here, they are level 80. And they stay level 80 all the way up to today in End of Dragons, which we're going to be calling Endwalker. So when you hit the end of Endwalker, you're level 80 again. You never leveled. So as soon as you hit max level, you are always max level. Heavensward, Stormblood, all max level. So there is no reason to have leveling dungeons anymore. So leveling roulette goes away altogether. Everything is that capstone. So it's not 50, 60, 70, 80 roulette. It would be 50 and beyond roulette if we brought that into this game. Because once we were 50, we were always 50. So it would just be the 50 roulette. And there would just be a growing number of dungeons in it. That means that once you have access to your level 50 abilities, you have access to all of your abilities. And that's it. Any new abilities added to the game would be added through new jobs, and you would have new what they call specializations, which are kind of how Summoner and Scholar work. And so you would add new job stones to things. And so maybe Red Mage should have been added to an existing class. And the way that class gained variety that was level 50 is it gained a new job stone. And that gave it new abilities. And so if you're tired of playing it the one way, just play it a different way. And so adding new job stones is how we add variety. Now, this does start to cause really weird stuff with their gearing system, because now your ARR gear is still relevant in Endwalker. So there's a lot of weird stuff that happens within Guild Wars as a result of this, but from a level sync only conversation, you are always max level. That means experience becomes this currency that really doesn't matter. And so actually, they give out items. They give out basically level boosts in-game. And they've added what's called a mastery system, so that experience kind of acts like a Diablo Paragon system, but a little bit less tied to power. And so maybe we would have the ability to apply experience to cheapen teleports to Aetherites within a certain expansion. Or maybe we would have things that acted as our crafting stones, and you put experience into that. And the various systems in this game, we would upgrade. Maybe we put experience into our retainers or something like that. They have different tabs. They all do something a little bit different. And you put these mastery points in there, and that's where your experience goes. You don't actually ever deal with what happens if I sink down, except when you do. So the upsides, I think, are very obvious right on the front end, in that you never have to deal with all the downsides of level sync from Final Fantasy, the downsides, but you also never deal with the upsides. Open world content feels weird. It feels weird. You're both powerful, but not like Diablo powerful, where everything dies in one hit. And so you end up in this action RPG kind of overpowered state, where it's just this mindless run through the open world, just ripping things apart. And so you feel almost like a blue mage, but not. And so there's an element of it where, like, I feel really powerful. They mostly handle it well, because the game is heavily skewed towards 80, because they basically had, since A Realm Reborn, to perfect the way that your max level feels, because that's the only level we've ever had. All of your trials, extremes, ultimates are inherently balanced, because, as best as possible, because they've never moved up in level. But where it really, really, truly falls apart, the con of Guild Wars versus Final Fantasy in Final Fantasy terms, is that anywhere vertical progression has been added to Guild Wars, it breaks. They did not add mounts and gliders until their Heavensward and Stormblood style expansions, and so any of the ARR zones break with mounts, like they do in Final Fantasy. And so anywhere that vertical progression does happen, it gets absolutely shattered. The other thing it does is it means that your meta really settles in, because your jobs, you're getting new job stones, not new job actions. And so if a job is deemed crap by the community or good by the community, even if it's only 5 or 10% out of alignment, many MMOs, oftentimes you find out that the Reddit or Discord or whatever that's optimizing this is assuming perfect gear and perfect play, which is not the average player, and they're getting it within single-digit percentages. And then you go out and you're like, okay, but I really like the way that job looks or feels or what it means narratively. And people are like, it's trash. You should delete your account. And so you end up with this exaggerated meta, because if Dark Knight was deemed crap in Stormblood, we would still feel that in Endwalker today. It's really hard to outpace that. My time in the community, the stereotypes around certain classes balance, when I ask questions like, well, would I not be able to bring them to this extreme? Well, I mean, you would, Well, would we not get a clear? I mean, you would. Okay, so a typical clear time on that fight is like 7 minutes. Would it be like 8 minutes? Yeah. Isn't Enrage at like 12 minutes? Uh-huh. So why don't I want to play it? Because it's garbage. Oh. And so, like, it doesn't allow the living, breathing document that the ongoing support of increasing your levels is. Not that that doesn't cause a separate set of problems, but we're talking about pros and cons here. I think Guild Wars has an immense number of pros that would fix Final Fantasy XIV's cons, but not without gaining Guild Wars cons. So then let's fix the Guild Wars cons. Let's go to World of Warcraft. World of Warcraft, we've added vertical progression back in. The vertical progression is great. The way World of Warcraft works is they always assumed that people would be caught up. And so it is much closer to watching CNN, the current today's news, than it is watching like the historical drama of Final Fantasy. We're always focused on today's content, and that means we are always focused on today's meta, today's raids, today's zones. It is this living, breathing party, and sometimes the party's bigger than others in recent years, but ultimately it is a giant circus. But what that means is that when that circus leaves town, it leaves that particular part of the world barren and destroyed, and you just need to move on to where the circus is now. And that is because they are always focused on max level content. There is no required story clear. There is no required previous dungeon or raid content. You just are always focused on today. And so when they went to add back later, they decided in their Stormblood type moment, oh my god, we do want to leverage legacy content, because when people get bored, they're asking for things that we have. They're just over there. And they don't know to look over there in legacy content. Well, unlike Guild Wars and Final Fantasy, they needed a way to reflect back because they're not forcing new players to do it. So what they did is they added a series of systems. One's called Time Walking, works a little weird. One's called Chromie Time, works a little weird. You end up with weird leveling type systems through things like Threads of Fate, but ultimately it all falls under your kind of world sync, I think is the term. And so what that means is you always view the world through your lens. Your computer monitor looking into the world is the valid and accurate view. And so the way that would translate into Final Fantasy XIV is, imagine you hit level 30 and got your job stone. You would equip it and you would leave it on forever and ever. Every time you gain an ability, you would have it. Your warrior switches to Fellcleave, you have Fellcleave. Your warrior gets, all of the amazingness that is Endwalker, you always have it. You always have it. But how does that work when I go back and run that Toto Rock run you mentioned? Well, that means that I actually come in and I have all of my Endwalker abilities in Toto Rock, and they do all of the scaling on the back end to basically make the world look similar to the Final Fantasy Unreal system, where it all comes up, but it comes up to meet me. So I'm in there at level 90 on my warrior. I see Toto Rock as a level 90 dungeon. All of the monsters are level 90. But I'm with Brian, and Brian is level 82 on his filthy bard. And what's he see? He sees level 82 monsters. But you're with us. You're down at level 30. You just got your job stone. That's amazing. What do you see the world as? Level 30. How does that work if we're all attacking the same boss? Well, the only way it can work is that it has to scale your damage to the monster that you see in your eyes, which means you are always only as powerful as you are relative to your level. Now in Guild Wars that would work fine, because once a level, always a level, and the gearing is already a weird system. So as long as it's scaling to the gearing's weird system, it works fine. Their gearing is just this like linear, like perpetual to a destination. There is a max point. Gear is solvable in Guild Wars because there's a max level. So there is a max gear, and once you have it forever. Well, in World of Warcraft, it's much closer to Final Fantasy, where we're adding 10 levels every 2 years. Okay. So what does that mean when I'm leveling? Well, when you are below the current expansion, just like Final Fantasy, it's very easy to be in incredibly powerful gear basically constantly. Dungeons drop a lot of it, quests drop a lot of it, you can funnel it back to you, crafters can funnel it to you, it's cheap on the market board because nobody cares. World of Warcraft even adds a system called heirlooms, where you can feed them gear that basically scales with you, like the pre-order earring. You know, in Final Fantasy, you share gear across classes, so you have gear kind of waiting in your armory chest. Up to, let's say, level 80, gear doesn't matter. We have previous tombstone sets, but what happens when you're in the current expansion? Well, right out of the gate, you start at the highest level of the previous expansion. So you start at level 80, going to 90. Okay? They go 50 to 60. So the first gear, the first level you are, the best gear you can have is the best in slot gear from the previous expansion. So the best thing you can do in Final Fantasy is pop over to Crystarium, spend your tomestones of poetics that you've been getting from your MSQ roulettes, and you can buy a 530 augmented tombstone set. World of Warcraft has lots of easily acquirable gear too, and so at level cap, especially if that class was capped from the previous expansion and spent time in the patch content, you're incredibly powerful for a level 80, because they have to design the content to be clearable from a new player who might have hit level 80 and not really have that great a gear. And so you likely are outrageously powerful, especially since we're talking in the conversation of an alt. You are likely outrageously powerful. So everything dies. It's super easy. You queue into a dungeon, it's amazing. Everything melts. You hit level 81. Well, relative to a level 81, you're still pretty powerful, but your item level hasn't gone up. But everything you're fighting has. So you're a little bit weaker. 82, a little bit weaker. 83, you are now what is expected. The level 83 dungeon, Babel drops 530 gear. It's lateral. You are now right where you should be. I mean, at the top of where you should be. So you're great, but you're not as powerful as you were at level 80. By the time you get to 85, Palaka's is likely the easiest set to get from Vanaspati. So you go get that set, and that brings you back up to where you were at 83, which means at 84, you might have been weak. And if you don't have a full Palaka set waiting, you're sliding behind. This continues on until you make the mistake of hitting level cap. Once you hit level cap, that's it. Now you are way off of best in slot. Oh my god. The gap from 89 to 90, your relative gear score to where it could be, your gear score at 89, theoretical best is like 542. Initial gear, when you first hit level 90, you're probably in like 598, and you should very easily be able to get up into the 560s, 570s. At this point, get into the upper 500s, and you're chasing 600. That will continue to rise as the expansion goes on. That means that you are weak. You're weak compared to what you could be. So, the faster you level without acquiring gear, the weaker you get rapidly. Rapidly. So the world sync system breaks because it has to focus on relative score. And so if your gear is going to matter at all, unless they're just going to start syncing gear, in which case gear is just literally useless, it's cosmetic only, they have to sync you to your stats. And you can break stats. You can basically do what WoW calls twinking, where you can get yourself into perfect gear for that level, which is just what Final Fantasy does in Ultimates. And so the benefit is that the game is very, very heavily focused on current content. And sometimes the Final Fantasy devs, Yoshi has expressed concern as recently as last October in an interview of we try to be careful spending too much time focused on old content because we don't want people getting the impression that we don't care about current content. That's a valid fear with the level sync system, with adding duty support. We don't want to spend so much time on old content that people think we don't care about. Think, not even that we don't. Just think it could be a new team, an additional team. We do not want people getting the wrong idea because impressions matter. And so the pros of World of Warcraft is nobody ever believes that they're caring about anything but their current content. Some people think they don't care about their current content either, but nobody ever thinks they don't care about their current content. But the disadvantage is then their legacy content is utterly forgotten. Time walking, Chromie Time, they are all a fraction of what they could be with something like the level sync system. So the level sync system, when we talk about it in Final Fantasy XIV, is one of many solutions. It has pros in that it attempts to preserve, as it was, as is reasonable, a version of the past. The downside is you inherit any flaws in the past, and you can directly compare them to the future because you're from the future. And so in real time, you are synced down and reminded of the weaknesses of the past, but also the strengths of the past. That is why UCOB and Eureka and all of that are still run to this day, because of their strengths. They are only the best of level sync content really lives on. I don't see people clamoring for Cutter's Cry runs. I don't see people clamoring for like, oh man, I hate that I don't get to run Dazmel Darkhold for tomes. The best content of the old content rises to the top. It does, and I think that's great. But unfortunately with it, any weaknesses from before are brought right back to light. But compared to Guild Wars and compared to World of Warcraft, this has allowed them to create a game that really focuses heavily on preserving its story, really focuses heavy on leveraging the fact that it has, is, and will always have a consistent patch schedule. The best way to show off how consistently they've added content to this game is to show an ever-increasing backlog of previous content, and to tell you your leveling roulette is a growingly large number of just massive number of dungeons. And when people go, hey, what's a relic? And we go, oh, are you working on the ARR relic, the Heavensward relic, the Stormblood relic, the Shadowbringers relic? Like, and they're like, leveraging legacy content is something the leveling sync system does really well. It just absolutely has flaws also. Kinda.